Hey everyone, and welcome to After Church, week 3 in our time in 1 Peter. So in week 1, we talked about who Peter was, that he was the unofficial leader of the 12 disciples, and he wrote this book to the persecuted Christians around the world to remind them that they have an inheritance in the family of Jesus Christ, the inheritance of salvation, and that as members of that family, we have the expectation of living with one another in agape, love that is a commitment to self-sacrificially serving one another. And this week, we're going to look at the fact that sometimes being a member of Christ's family can bring hardships. So we're going to look in chapter 4, verses 12 through 14. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. So I have a crazy fact for you. I remember when I first realized this, it really blew my mind. So, of course, Jesus had 12 disciples, and Judas dies at the end of the Gospels, but he's quickly replaced. So that new group of 12 disciples spreads out all over the world to bring the gospel message. Here's the crazy fact. Everyone except John was martyred for their faith. 11 of the 12 disciples was killed for their belief in Jesus. Peter, the author of our book, was crucified in Rome, upside down. See, Peter, traveling around, he saw and heard about the persecution that the Christians were experiencing. And he wrote this book to those very persecuted Christians. And several years later, his persecution went all the way to death on the cross, hanging upside down. So there's a lot we can get out of this pretty heavy passage, but I just want to lift up 2 important points. First, we shouldn't be surprised that there may be suffering for our faith. After all, the very founder and foundation of the faith, Jesus, suffered the most and deserved it the least. Now, most of us won't experience that level of persecution, but that hasn't been the case throughout history. Millions and millions of Christians have suffered greatly for their faith. And even right now, Christians around the world are the most persecuted religion. But not all suffering is physical. Even Peter says in verse 14 that you may be insulted for your faith. And that is a type of suffering or persecution, to be insulted, to be shamed, to be cast aside for what you believe. And here's the second point. Peter counterintuitively says that we should be overjoyed when we experience suffering, because it unites us to Christ's suffering. And it gives us the opportunity to love those who persecute us. You see, Jesus taught that the best way to respond when someone persecutes you is not to get vengeance. It's to love them. Love them with agape, self-sacrificially doing what's best for them, not what's best for you. But here's the harsh reality. Just because we love someone with agape doesn't mean that they will stop persecuting you. After all, Jesus loved with agape more perfectly than anyone ever, and yet his persecution went all the way to death on a cross. We practice agape love with our enemies, not because it works, but because it's what we're called to do. It is the best way to change someone's heart so they can see God's love working through us. But sometimes it doesn't change their actions. But God promises that in God's time, all things will be made right. It is up to us not to make things right, but to follow Jesus' example of loving those who persecute us. So, what do you do when you face suffering or persecution? Have you ever been insulted or ashamed for what you believe? How did you respond? Do you think that we can love those who persecute us with the agape love that Jesus has for us? Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week for week 4 in 1 Peter.